Part 3, Swann in Love, Section 4. After the pianist had played, Swann felt and showed more interest in him than in any of the other guests for the following reason. The year before, at an evening party, he had heard a piece of music played on the piano and violin. At first he had appreciated only the material quality of the sounds which those instruments secreted, and it had been a source of keen pleasure when, below the narrow ribbon of the violin part, delicate, unyielding, substantial, and governing the whole, he had suddenly perceived, where it was trying to surge upwards in a flowing tide of sound, the mass of the piano part, multiform, coherent, level, and breaking everywhere in melody like the deep blue tumult of the sea, silvered and charmed into a minor key by the moonlight. But at a given moment, without being able to distinguish any clear outline, or to give a name to what was pleasing him, suddenly enraptured, he had tried to collect, to treasure in his memory the phrase or harmony, he knew not which, that had just been played, and had opened and expanded his soul, just as the fragrance of certain roses, wafted upon the moist air of evening, has the power of dilating our nostrils. Perhaps it was owing to his own ignorance of music that he had been able to receive so confused an impression, one of those that are, notwithstanding, are only purely musical impressions, limited in their extent, entirely original, and irreducible into any other kind. An impression of this order, vanishing in an instant, is, so to speak, an impression sine materia. Presumably the notes which we hear at such moments tend to spread out before our eyes, over surfaces greater or smaller according to their pitch and volume, to trace arabesque designs, to give us the sensation of breadth or tenuity, stability or caprice. But the notes themselves have vanished before these sensations have developed sufficiently to escape submersion under those which the following, or even simultaneous notes, have already begun to awaken in us. And this indefinite perception would continue to smother in its molten liquidity the motifs which now and then emerge, barely discernible, to plunge again and disappear and drown, recognized only by the particular kind of pleasure which they instill, impossible to describe, to recollect, to name, ineffable. If our memory, like a laborer who toils at the laying down of firm foundations beneath the tumult of the waves, did not, by fashioning for us facsimiles of those fugitive phrases, enable us to compare and to contrast them with those that follow. And so, hardly had the delicious sensation which Swann had experienced died away before his memory had furnished him with an immediate transcript, summary, it is true, and provisional, but one on which he had kept his eyes fixed while the playing continued, so effectively that, when the same impression suddenly returned, it was no longer uncapturable. He was able to picture to himself its extent, its symmetrical arrangement, its notation, the strength of its expression. He had before him that definite object which was no longer pure music, but rather design, architecture, thought, and which allowed the actual music to be recalled. This time he had distinguished, quite clearly, a phrase which emerged for a few moments from the waves of sound. It had at once held out to him an invitation to partake of intimate pleasures, of whose existence before hearing it he had never dreamed, into which he felt that nothing but this phrase could initiate him. And he had been filled with love for it as with a new and strange desire. With a slow and rhythmical movement it led him here, there, everywhere, towards a state of happiness noble, unintelligible, yet clearly indicated. And then, suddenly having reached a certain point from which he was prepared to follow it, after pausing for a moment, abruptly it changed its direction, and in a fresh movement, more rapid, multiform, melancholy, incessant, sweet, it bore him off with it towards a vista of joys unknown. Then it vanished. He hoped with a passionate longing that he might find it again a third time, and reappear it did, though without speaking to him more clearly, bringing him indeed a pleasure less profound. But when he was once more at home, he needed it. He was like a man into whose life a woman, whom he has seen for a moment passing by, has brought a new form of beauty, which strengthens and enlarges his own power of perception, without his knowing even whether he is ever to see her again whom he loves already, although he knows nothing of her, not even her name. Indeed, this passion for a phrase of music seemed, in the first few months, to be bringing into Swann's life the possibility of a sort of rejuvenation. He had so long since ceased to direct his course towards any ideal goal, and had confined himself to the pursuit of ephemeral satisfactions, that he had come to believe, though without ever formally stating his belief even to himself, that he would remain all his life in that condition, which death alone could alter. More than this, since his mind no longer entertained any lofty ideals, he had ceased to believe in, although he could not have expressly denied, their reality. He had grown also into the habit of taking refuge in trivial considerations, which allowed him to set on one side matters of fundamental importance. Just as he had never stopped to ask himself whether he would not have done better by not going into society, knowing very well that if he had accepted an invitation he must put in an appearance, and that afterwards, if he did not actually call, he must at least leave cards upon his hostess. So in his conversation he took care never to express with any warmth a personal opinion about a thing, but instead would supply facts and details which had a value of a sort in themselves, and excused him from showing how much he really knew. He would be extremely precise about the recipe for a dish, the dates of a painter's birth and death, and the titles of his works. Sometimes, in spite of himself, he would let himself go so far as to utter a criticism of a work of art, or of some one's interpretation of life. But then he would cloak his words in a tone of irony, as though he did not altogether associate himself with what he was saying. But now, like a confirmed invalid, whom, all of a sudden, a change of air and surroundings, or a new course of treatment, or, as sometimes happens, an organic change in himself, spontaneous and unaccountable, seems to have so far recovered from his malady that he begins to envisage the possibility, hitherto beyond all hope, of starting to lead, and better late than never, a wholly different life. Swann found in himself, in the memory of the phrase that he had heard, in certain other sonatas which he had made people play over to him to see whether he might not perhaps discover his phrase among them, the presence of one of those invisible realities in which he had ceased to believe, but to which, as though the music had had upon the moral barrenness from which he was suffering a sort of recreative influence, he was conscious once again of a desire, almost, indeed, of the power to consecrate his life. But, never having managed to find out whose work it was that he had heard played that evening, he had been unable to procure a copy, and finally had forgotten the quest. He had indeed, in the course of the next few days, encountered several of the people who had been at the party with him, and had questioned them. But most of them had either arrived after or left before the piece was played. Some had indeed been in the house, but had gone into another room to talk, and those who had stayed to listen had no clearer impression than the rest. As for his hosts, they knew that it was a recently published work, which the musicians whom they had engaged for the evening had asked to be allowed to play, but, as these last were now on tour somewhere, Swann could learn nothing further. He had, of course, a number of musical friends, but, vividly as he could recall the exquisite and inexpressible pleasure which the little phrase had given him, and could see still before his eyes the forms that it had traced in outline, he was quite incapable of humming over to them the air, and so, at last, he ceased to think of it. But to-night, at Madame Verdurin's, scarcely had the little pianist begun to play, when suddenly, after a high note held on through 2 whole bars, Swann saw it approaching, stealing forth from underneath that resonance, which was prolonged and stretched out over it, like a curtain of sound, to veil the mystery of its birth, and recognized, secret, whispering, articulate, the airy and fragrant phrase that he had loved. And it was so peculiarly itself, it had so personal a charm which nothing else could have replaced, that Swann felt as though he had met in a friend's drawing room a woman whom he had seen and admired once in the street, and had despaired of ever seeing her again. Finally the phrase withdrew and vanished, pointing, directing, diligent among the wandering currents of its fragrance, leaving upon Swann's features a reflection of its smile. But now, at last, he could ask the name of his fair unknown, and was told that it was the andante movement of Von Toya's sonata for the piano and violin. He held it safe, could have it again to himself, at home, as often as he would, could study its language and acquire its secret. And so, when the pianist had finished, Swann crossed the room and thanked him with a vivacity which delighted Madame Verdurin. "Isn't he charming?" she asked Swann. "Doesn't he just understand it, his sonata, the little wretch? You never dreamed, did you, that a piano could be made to express all that? Upon my word, there's everything in it except the piano. I'm caught out every time I hear it. I think I'm listening to an orchestra. Though it's better, really, than an orchestra, more complete." The young pianist bent over her as he answered, smiling and underlining each of his words as though he were making an epigram, "You are most generous to me." And while Madame Verdurin was saying to her husband, "Run and fetch him a glass of orangeade, it's well earned," Swann began to tell Odette how he had fallen in love with that little phrase. When their hostess, who was a little way off, called out, "Well, it looks to me as though someone was saying nice things to you, Odette," she replied, "Yes, very nice," and he found her simplicity delightful. Then he asked for some information about this Von Toye, what else he had done, and at what period in his life he had composed the sonata. What meaning the little phrase could have had for him, that was what Swann wanted most to know. But none of these people who professed to admire this musician, when Swann had said that the sonata was really charming, Madame Verdurin had exclaimed, "I quite believe it! Charming indeed! But you don't dare to confess that you don't know Von Toye's sonata. You have no right not to know it." And the painter had gone on with, "Ah, yes, it's a very fine bit of work, isn't it? Not, of course, if you want something obvious, something popular, but, I mean to say, it makes a very great impression on us artists." None of them seemed ever to have asked himself these questions, for none of them was able to reply. Even to one or two particular remarks made by Swann on his favorite phrase, "Do you know, that's a funny thing. I had never noticed it. I may as well tell you that I don't much care about peering at things through a microscope and pricking myself on pin points of difference. No, we don't waste time splitting hairs in this house. Why not? Well, it's not a habit of ours, that's all," Madame Verdurin replied, while Dr. Cottard gazed at her with open-mouthed admiration, and yearned to be able to follow her as she skipped lightly from one stepping stone to another of her stock of ready-made phrases. Both he, however, and Madame Cottard, with a kind of common sense which is shared by many people of humble origin, would always take care not to express an opinion or to pretend to admire a piece of music which they would confess to each other, once they were safely at home, that they no more understood than they could understand the art of Master Biche. Inasmuch as the public cannot recognize the charm, the beauty, even the outlines of nature, save in the stereotyped impressions of an art which they have gradually assimilated, while an original artist starts by rejecting those impressions, so Monsieur and Madame Cottard, typical in this respect of the public, were incapable of finding either in Von Toye's sonata or in Biche's portraits what constituted harmony for them in music or beauty in painting. It appeared to them, when the pianist played his sonata, as though he were striking haphazard from the piano a medley of notes which bore no relation to the musical forms to which they themselves were accustomed, and that the painter simply flung the colors haphazard upon his canvas. When on one of these they were able to distinguish a human form, they always found it coarsened and vulgarized, that is to say, lacking all the elegance of the school of painting through whose spectacles they themselves were in the habit of seeing the people, real, living people, who passed them in the streets, and devoid of truth, as though Monsieur Biche had not known how the human shoulder was constructed, or that a woman's hair was not ordinarily purple. And yet, when the faithful were scattered out of earshot, the doctor felt that the opportunity was too good to be missed, and so, while Madame Verdurin was adding a final word of commendation of Von Toye's sonata, like a would-be swimmer who jumps into the water, so as to learn, but chooses a moment when there are not too many people looking on, "Yes, indeed, he's what they call a musician di primo cartello," he exclaimed with a sudden determination. Swann discovered no more than that the recent publication of Von Toye's sonata had caused a great stir among the most advanced school of musicians, but that it was still unknown to the general public. "I know someone quite well called Von Toye," said Swann, thinking of the old music master at Combray who had taught my grandmother's sisters. "Perhaps that's the man!" cried Madame Verdurin. "Oh, no!" Swann burst out laughing. "If you had ever seen him for a moment, you wouldn't put the question." "Then to put the question is to solve the problem?" the doctor suggested. "But it may well be some relative," Swann went on. "That would be bad enough, but after all, there is no reason why a genius shouldn't have a cousin who is a silly old fool. And if that should be so, I swear there's no known or unknown form of torture I wouldn't undergo to get the old fool to introduce me to the man who composed the sonata, starting with the torture of the old fool's company, which would be ghastly." The painter understood that Von Toya was seriously ill at the moment, and that Dr. Potain despaired of his life. "What?" cried Madame Verdurin. "Do people still call in Potain?" "Ah, Madame Verdurin," Cottard simpered, "you forget that you are speaking of one of my colleagues, I should say one of my masters." The painter had heard somewhere that Von Toya was threatened with the loss of his reason, and he insisted that signs of this could be detected in certain passages in the sonata. This remark did not strike Swann as ridiculous, rather it puzzled him. For, since a purely musical work contains none of those logical sequences, the interruption or confusion of which in spoken or written language is a proof of insanity, so insanity diagnosed in a sonata seemed to him as mysterious a thing as the insanity of a dog or a horse, although instances may be observed of these. "Don't speak to me about your masters; you know 10 times as much as he does," Madame Verdurin answered Dr. Cottard, in the tone of a woman who has the courage of her convictions, and is quite ready to stand up to any one who disagrees with her. "Anyhow, you don't kill your patients." "But, Madame, he is in the Academy." The doctor smiled with bitter irony. "If a sick person prefers to die at the hands of one of the princes of science, it is far more smart to be able to say, 'Yes, I have Potain.'" "Oh, indeed, more smart, is it?" said Madame Verdurin. "So there are fashions nowadays in illness, are there? I didn't know that. Oh, you do make me laugh!" she screamed suddenly, burying her face in her hands. "And here was I, poor thing, talking quite seriously, and never seeing that you were pulling my leg." As for Monsieur Verdurin, finding it rather a strain to start laughing again over so small a matter, he was content with puffing out a cloud of smoke from his pipe, while he reflected sadly that he could never again hope to keep pace with his wife in her Atalanta flights across the field of mirth. "Do you know, we like your friend so very much," said Madame Verdurin later, when Odette was bidding her good night. "He is so unaffected, quite charming. If they're all like that, the friends you want to bring here, by all means bring them." Monsieur Verdurin remarked that Swann had failed, all the same, to appreciate the pianist's aunt. "I dare say he felt a little strange, poor man," suggested Madame Verdurin. "You can't expect him to catch the tone of the house the first time he comes, like Cottard, who has been one of our little clan now for years. The first time doesn't count; it's just for looking round and finding out things. Odette, he understands all right. He's to join us to morrow at the Châtelet. Perhaps you might call for him and bring him." "No, he doesn't want that." "Oh, very well, just as you like, provided he doesn't fail us at the last moment." End of Part 3, Section 4,